Welcome to Twice 5 Miles Radio, fertile ground for conversations worth listening to and remembering. I'm your host, James Nave, always airing first on WPVM LP Asheville 103.7, streaming online, WPVMFM.org, the voice of Asheville, heard all over the world. Thank you, Walter Parks, for our theme song. WalterParks.com for more on Walter's music. Thank you, Davine Dial, for managing WPVM-FM, and Robin Collier for managing KCEI, Cultural Energy Radio, coming out of Taos, New Mexico. You can always reach me, Nave, at jamesnave.com. I would love to hear from you. I'd like to remind you, we're sponsored by the Imaginative Storm Writing Project. If you would like to improve your writing chops, imaginativestorm.com is a great place to start. Today, I have a new friend on. Sometimes I have people on this call I've never met before. This fellow I have met before. In fact, we shared some adventures in Manila. His name is Sean Williams, and we connected because he has a terrific podcast called the UNDERWORLD Podcast. You can stream it on all the platforms. I've been a fan for maybe a year or so. I reached out to him with a journalistic tip. He was working on a story, and I thought maybe he would like to follow up on this tip. He did follow up on it, and in the course of our exchange, he said, I'm going to be in Manila. I said, let's have a coffee. He said, yes. So we met, we had lunch, we connected again for a second gathering of food and coffee, and then we walked a bit through Manila. So we've had some adventures, and he also went to the Manila Art Fair with my partner Tish and me. So we were all there together. So it was a real pleasure to sit and talk with Sean about the things that are going on in the world that we don't see. And he agreed to come on my show, and we're going to have a chat now. So Sean, welcome to Twice 5 Miles Radio.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, and I appreciate you showing up and being with me and with my friend Paco and with Tish here in Manila. It's great. And it was hot, but we still walked. And walking is a good thing, don't you think?
Walking is the best salve for any situation, especially when you've been running around Manila for the last week or so reporting on some crazy stuff. So always good, no matter what the weather.
So you're a journalist, you're a reporter, you go out in the world and you tour around and you examine things. These close examinations have great value to each of us who do it personally. I do it in a different way. What kind of value do you think these close examinations have to the people beyond your own reach, the greater world? Why do you do this? And tell us a little bit about what you do.
To start off, I'm a magazine feature writer primarily, so that's my bread and butter. So I write for publications including The New Yorker and Harper's Magazine and Rolling Stone and GQ, these kind of long form. I think we're supposed to call them long form these days. That's the going word. So I try to dig into a subject and really sink my teeth in and go the distance with a subject or a topic or a character. And what I love is exactly that about my job, is that I get to go explore things and be adventurous and see and meet people that I would never normally get the chance to. I mean, I'm working on stories right now. To give you an example, the 3 deadlines that I'm working towards are the domestic life of people living in a slum in Metro Manila, a world champion freediver, a North Korean defector. So these are quite disparate topics, but I guess from a writer's perspective, they all come down to the same thing, which gets to your point, which is that I hope that on 2 levels, my stories could reach people. One is that people realize that there are stories and there is value to everybody around the world, really. Everybody has a story, and there are stories in the most unlikely of places that we can discover, dig into, and really try to understand. And I think secondly, what I try and do from my subject's perspective is lift the lid on people whose lives I don't think the daily reporters would really get the chance to do. That's not to say that I'm doing something better than them. It's just that they don't have the kind of economy or the world around them that would allow them to do it. So I guess from those 2 different perspectives, that's what I'm trying to achieve. And to do so is You could be quite conceptual about it, but basically it comes down to story. Everything is about story. Everything is about laying a kind of sometimes classic, sometimes a bit conceptual narrative over something in real life. And that's what makes great nonfiction writing.
But when you say everything is about story, I agree with you because I love storytelling. A lot of people listening to my show write. Some of them are returning to writing because they haven't done it in a while. Some of them have been doing it for a while. The question often arises, what makes a story? So in your world, when you go into, say, the slums of Manila and you identify a group of people you'd like to work with, what are the elements that you bring to your writing you feel propel that story forward in a way that makes it personal for the reader?
Actually, the one that I'm working on is for Harper's Magazine in this slum in Quezon, which is a part of this huge megalopolis of Metro Manila, which isn't actually Manila, but it is. It's hard to kind of describe to outsiders. I had first gone to that slum. I think it was 2015, before the former president Duterte came to power. And I'd gone in there with a view to writing about extreme poverty in Manila because I come from a working class background and I've always thought that poverty and economic situations are really badly written about in the media generally. And I think that's a vacuum of writing ability primarily, and because of who comes to the writing field. It often just holds a mirror up to who gets the jobs. And especially in the UK, that tends to be people from advantaged backgrounds. I kept coming back to Manila year after year. And when Duterte came to power, he enacted this very violent, brutal drug war that was essentially a veiled war on the poor, although arguably every war is a war on the poor. The reporting that I was doing for the dailies and sort of shorter magazine articles, they were chasing the bodies that were dropping every night in this really bloody drug war. But I kept coming back to this slum and these three women who were the kind of chief matriarchs of this wider family. I think they had 6 or 7 sons, most of whom were taking a methamphetamine, which is the drug of choice. And I thought, well, I'll just dig into this, whether or not somebody had a loved one who was killed by the cops or vigilantes or anything. That would be the standout, the kind of if it bleeds, it leads newspaper side of it. But I thought, well, there will be interesting dynamics to pull out of this neighborhood. And so I just went back year after year after year. And finally, when I went to New York on my last visit to speak to editors in October, my Harper's editor went, that sounds fantastic. You should go for that. So I get to compile a decade of reporting on this one tiny corner of a huge city as they experience this drug war. I've been kind of reading stuff that I think would help, which is, obviously every writer should be doing that if they're going to put together an article about things. And I found myself veering towards the kind of John McPhee, almost a piece of nonfiction that is a paean to the idea of nonfiction itself, in that, okay, hell to it, I'm going to write an entire book about oranges and you're going to read it because I'm going to make it so damn good. And so this family, although they didn't experience the full horrors of the drug war perhaps, or have these incredibly kinetic, violent actions happen to them, I feel that you can tell the wider story of the poverty and the cultural underlying issues behind the drug war almost even better, because it's a really quotidian story. It's done with these really powerful characters at the heart, these three women, the three Marias, they call themselves, or the people that they don't like in the Badangay, the neighborhood, they call them the three dragon ladies. So it kind of weaves in many different forms. It's the gender aspect, it's the poverty aspect, it's the makeup of a Philippine neighborhood, which I don't think many people really get a handle on. So yeah, that was kind of, in a reporter sense, it's just about spending the damn time, getting to know them, caring about them with a professional distance, but being able to spend 4 to 5 hours a day without peeing them off. You don't want to, you're taking a lot of their time up, and they are not just your subjects, they are living, breathing people. All writing issues in feature writing are essentially, the phrase goes, a reporting issue. And so if you're struggling for content, you haven't done your job properly. You should be cutting stuff out rather than puffing it up. But on the story side, the same is also true, right? Because you kind of find those plot points and those characters and the antagonists that are going to carry a story. And it only really took until 2018, 2019 for me to find them in this case. But I did, and I'm really happy with where the story is going to end up now.
When you first entered this arena in 2015, I think you said, right?
2015, I think it was, yeah.
So when you first entered Manila in 2015, you came with a set of ideas, maybe values. You enter the arena, you come to the neighborhood, you start to make the connections. How did your experiences change you personally? And when did you start to feel like, I'm beginning to understand this? How long did that take? And what did you do to make that happen?
It's interesting that when I first rocked up in this neighborhood a decade ago, over a decade ago now, I think that I was pretty green as a features writer. I'd kind of gone around the houses and had quite a circuitous way towards feature writing. And I gravitated towards some of the really devastatingly poor parts of the city that people write about a lot. There is a perfect example, a place called Smoky Mountain. It's just a pile of trash. People live in the trash. They work on the trash. They scavenge, and they live in sort of clapboard huts that are built out of the remnants of whatever garbage ends up there. It's horrific. It's been written about a lot. One of the reasons that I gravitated towards a different part of the city was that I actually realized that I was doing something a little immoral. I was kind of building almost a poverty porn. The reporting was a little bit rubbernecky, and it wasn't really grounded in the kind of character-led journalism that I would want to do. And so I went all over the city looking at different neighborhoods. My kind of protagonist in the story is a woman called Yolanda. People call her Yolanda Salamanca because Salamanca basically means witch. And she's really impish and puckish, and she's genuinely funny. And she has this past in activism. I don't ever want to give credence to the idea that people are poor but cheerful thing. It's a terrible paradigm. People here have got nothing, but they've always got a smile on their face. Well, that's not true. I don't want to give credence to the idea that someone needs to be extraordinarily poor or extraordinarily rich to merit a story about them. The place that I'm reporting on, this place called Talayan, it's poor. It's not the poorest. It's relatively comfortable by Manila standards, which is not comfortable. I found that over the years, there is a precariousness to people's lives in these kind of metropolises that grew in the 20th century for various different reasons, especially all over Asia and Africa, where the city just couldn't keep up with the people in it. It strains and it buckles and it floods and it bakes. It took me years to realize that the drug war is just another iteration of this precarity that people are living with. And it's just another kind of demon on their shoulder that they have to deal with. I was speaking to one of the women last week. They said a flood came through last year, washed everything away, took everyone's possessions, and it took them a couple of days, and they built the house back. And they said it was the same in the drug war. It was violent, but it felt the same because someone or a couple of people died. It's that kind of economic tension that I wanted to try and build into the story more than anything else. I think most people in Metro Manila would consider not overly destitute. They're also living on the breadline, and they're also struggling, which is a story of the world as we're living in it all over the place right now, that the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and lives generally are becoming more debt-ridden and precarious.
In the work you do, you travel all over the world. You see all kinds of cities. You go into the very deep arenas where people wouldn't dare go, with drug lords and arms dealers and many, many different people that you cover on your podcast. Here in Manila, there's a big contrast. You can go to BGC, the business district, and see a dealership that's selling Lamborghinis and Bentleys. 5 miles away or less, a mile away, you see the slums. Can you speak a bit about that contrast? The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. And it's quite stark here in a way that I don't see it elsewhere.
Yeah.
Where I'm living is very comfortable, no problems at all. And yet the guards that are in the village that houses about 10,000 people, probably 250 guards working all the gates to make sure that the people who live inside these gates have the security they need. Not so true outside. So can you speak to that contrast a bit to give people a sense of how that might work from your point of view?
I mean, I live in New Zealand. I live in Wellington, New Zealand, which is an extremely comfortable, relatively affluent city. Has its issues, but that's where we're at. I'm from London, same thing. Has a lot, probably more issues. Whereas other cities have shared infrastructure for getting around the place, or even buildings just to look at. I don't think that even exists in a lot of parts of Manila. There are roads and buildings and even viewpoints and angles that you can only see if you're wealthy. Take, for example, Talayan again. This is where it kind of is exceptional, actually, because it stands at the kind of cross point of two major intersections. So you've got one of the main roads, Quezon Avenue, which is a huge, sprawling freeway, always chock full of traffic, even more so now, as you well know, the traffic is insane there. Running over the top of it is something called the Skyway, which is essentially a rich person's way of getting away from the traffic, which is quite expensive, really, as a toll road that goes right sort of north, east to southwest. Now, both of those arteries are cut off to anyone living in any kind of a slum, right? Because A, they don't have a car, and if they had one, it would be tiny, and they wouldn't be able to pay the toll. Forget any of the roads. That's not for you. Next door to Talayan are a series of giant funerary homes and columbariums, right? So, but these are not where the poor are buried or cremated. These are where the rich are done so. So, and these things are probably, to people listening in the States or in the UK or anywhere else, these are unrecognizable buildings. I mean, they're giant, weird, neo they're sort of Greco-Roman columned monstrosities erected in the 80s or 90s. They look like something lifted straight from a Marvel comic, but they just have floor upon floor upon floor of gold-plated funerary niches. They are, without doubt, the strangest buildings I've ever come across in my entire life. Needless to say, they're also out of commission for these people. They can't afford to bury their dead there, especially if they get killed in the drug war. There's a gate that separates Talayan from a very wealthy neighborhood called Talayan Village. Both of those are administered by the same town leader. He, in this case, only cares about the rich people across the divide. The other people are basically untermenschen, and then they're not even, accounted for in various things. And when you have something very violent like a drug war, you might want to send the cops in their direction and not in the direction of the rich. I mean, essentially the schisms and the fault lines are where they are in every city, but in Manila, they are unbelievably stark in that you could literally just stand facing anywhere and you could see where the rich people go and where the poor people go. And one area smells different to the other one. You can't see the mountains from anywhere at street level, but if you get up 10 floors, you could see the greenery around the city. You will never see that from street level. It's like that kind of tiered dystopian sort of, San Angeles that you get in Blade Runner. It's really sort of future noir-y. And it even has the Art Deco architecture to boot. So it's pretty nuts.
Tish and I had to go to Subic Bay for a meeting, and she was having this meeting. So we drove out day before yesterday, came back yesterday. We drove the Skyway. The Skyway's 3 or 4 stories high. It truly seems sky-like, and the cost is quite expensive, like $5-6 every 20 miles or something like that.
Yeah, even for a Western city, that's pretty costly.
It's high, and the Skyways are privately owned. Whoever owns that road, ka-ching, ka-ching, as all of the cars go by. Of course, all of the cars are brand new. As I drive over, I think of what's underneath, and I know a bit of what's underneath there. And that contrast is really stark. And the Skyway is so removed from all of that other stuff. When you work with these people in the area, the neighborhood you're in, talk a bit about how, as a journalist, how you craft your stories. What is your responsibility as a journalist? The reason I ask this, we're living in a world now, you often hear people say, I don't know what to believe. I tend to believe journalists like you, whom I know, carrying the journalism standards that they learned years ago. There's an ethical thing going on there. So speak of journalism ethics and how that works. And then can you flesh out a bit more of the characters you're working with so we can get a better sense of their personalities?
Yeah, I mean, when people talk to me or when people come at me with a pretty negative, the fake news sort of view of all journalism or try and lump the media into one barrel, I've tended to say that on one hand, Daniel Day-Lewis is an actor, but also the guy who plays Barney the dinosaur is also an actor. So there are shades everywhere. And one journalist is not the same as the next journalist, and there are a million different variations. But the truth is an asymptote, right? We can't fully grasp truth. I can get on the postmodern train with some of this stuff, and there are biases inherent to every media and every platform and every person, but it's still something to strive for. And if you don't strive for it, I don't see how anybody can make the argument that that is a more valuable piece of information. So I'm increasingly becoming radicalized against social media. I just think it's a really tawdry, toxic, terrible place to be getting your information. I mean, these are privately owned companies whose economic model rests on attention and conflict. They are not bothered about truth. Now, you could argue that certain media platforms feel the same way, but it's not to the extent that it is on, say, Twitter or Facebook or any of these other platforms. In a very basic structural sense, my stories are fact checked by 2 or 3 people. So if I bake in something that is false in any way, they'll pick it up and I'll get dragged for it. And the thing that comes out the other side is pretty on the money. And I mean, I've been doing this for what, 12, making a full-time living out of doing this since probably 2012, let's say. And I've never had any major comeback on any story, apart from the guy who's currently suing me for $100 million in California, which is a different story altogether. Factually, these get ironed out, and you have editors and you have people that work with you. And, if you're a good journalist, and I would hope that I am, you're constantly consulting your peers and friends and family for advice, or it takes a village, really. It's not just me. It's far more useful, I think, to the consumer than 140 characters of someone drunk at 2 a.m. popping off about X, Y, and Z. So yeah, I hope that answers your question somewhat.
You were saying you're getting more and more radicalized. Can you build that a bit out? What does that mean when you say you're radicalized? Because you do work with your podcast. You are online. You send your stories out. I have a Zoom call with you. This is not necessarily social media. I understand Facebook and X or Twitter and LinkedIn and all the rest of them have a different vibe. What is making you so radicalized, and how does that feel in your system?
I would say there was a period about a year back when I was sort of falling into that social media hole that I think that a lot of people could empathize with, where you get angry, you take your little mind fart, and then you get a little hit of dopamine. You think, oh, I've had a little fight back, or I've said my word, or I might have won an argument or whatever. It doesn't shift the needle. It doesn't do anything. It's so rare. I mean, when was the last time you saw anyone have a reasoned debate as you might do in a pub or a restaurant or a cafe online? It doesn't go that way. It's not meant to go that way. In fact, if you click on the For You page on Twitter, you'll just get a bunch of complete psychopaths arguing with each other. Why would you walk into a room, per se, and have a conversation with 50 people, 30 of whom probably aren't even real, 15 of whom you wouldn't even bat an eyelid or give the time of day in if they sidled up to you in a pub? So why would you have that? For the benefit of somebody else who's taking money off of the advertising of all of it. So I can just see that when I compare, and I've done this quite a bit to experiment on my own, to kind of spend a day reading social media and see how I feel about the news, and spend a day reading only the New York Times or the Guardian or Fox News, whatever, but reported out stuff. And I'm far more informed and reasoned and not angry, and can form cogent thought from the latter. What good piece of information did you ever get in 5 seconds? None, ever. You need people to work on things for it to have value.
Well, I may say that sometimes I have gotten in 5 seconds a tip on the kind of shirt that I might like to buy, but that's about as far as.
Well, you're getting good tips, actually, may I say.
I do take your point. So for people out there, and I know plenty of them who get really involved in these arguments online and they feel like they're doing something, What are you doing in respect to your behavioral changes? You're saying you read more long form journalism. Now, I listen to some podcasts. I actually enjoy what you do on your podcast. It
Mm.
seems like when I hear you report that you've actually done the work. You actually know what you're talking about. You know, the mobster guy in Montreal or the
Yeah.
character over in Myanmar or someplace where you actually seem like you know these people. So what are you doing personally to move yourself more and more away from that? Is it easy? Is it hard? How does it work?
It's not always easy. I think that I have a couple of rules with Twitter. Let's say Twitter is my cocaine. So it's like, it's the dopamine rush that I was sort of getting into. As you'll find with a lot of reporters, they love it. So I said to myself, right, I'm not going to post anything. I'll just retweet articles that I like. That's it. And my own work. So I just snoop around on Twitter now. I don't really do anything on it. Unfortunately, for work, it's a wonderful tool for meeting sources and contacts. So I do have to have it. Same with Instagram. Bizarrely, it's an incredible tool for finding people in strange places who are taking selfies in, say, border towns in Myanmar. It's unbelievable. If you type the hashtag of that place in, you'll find people. And the podcast that myself and Danny do, we really try to sell the idea that we are jobbing journalists and we are doing reporting into this stuff, which is to say, you know, we're just saying, trust us, essentially, the same as any platform is. We do always implore people to go out and read and, you know, not in a do your own research TM kind of way, but actually we publish a reading list with all of our sources. We say we'll never use Wikipedia or any other sort of encyclopedic sources. We'll always use reputable news outlets. So we kind of show our workings quite a lot. We do get people reaching out to correct us, and we always say we love that, and we'll in the next show we'll issue any corrections that we get, which I think is increasingly rare in a world where it's become the norm to sort of double down on your mistakes and tell everyone to shove off. But so, I mean, that's basically how we do it. And I hope that makes us a little bit more reputable than, you know, the usual two guys in their basement who run a bar who are suddenly talking about geopolitics or something. And we try and keep opinion out as much as we can. We try and just report on the news at hand.
So when I reached out to you, I gave you a tip. How often do you get tips from people that you're able to follow up on, and how does that work for you?
Quite a lot. Yeah, quite a lot. People reach out. I would say around 60% of it is the equivalent of that family member who says, "Oh, you should do a story about my uncle," which is usually not good. And a lot of it tends to be, more of it these days tends to be quite conspiratorial nonsense, essentially. There is an interesting effect when you start working in the trade. When you begin, you've got a blank page, you've got nothing to go on. And then over the time, people will reach out to you because they liked your story on this or they like your story on that. And I would say that's been how half of my stories come about now, is someone giving me a little snippet or an idea off the back of something else that I've done. Could be something entirely different. They just like the tenor of something that I've produced in the past, and they think that you might be a good fit for whatever they've got on their mind. But to answer your question, quite a lot. Yeah, there are quite a lot of tips. Yeah.
Yeah, because when I sent you the contact I had with Petra Khashoggi, I thought, well, you know, these guys might be interested in it. What will they do? In your podcast, you included her and her friend quite a bit to
Mm.
back up what you were saying. So I noticed that you were able to use her. Tell us a little bit more about the podcast. A lot of people that are listening may be unfamiliar with what you do. It's called the Underworld Podcast. And what's it all about, and why would somebody want to listen to it?
Well, it started back in 2020. Myself and Danny are both reporters who have worked on conflict and organized crime, especially for years. And we had a guardian angel who was a guy I knew. I used to live in Germany. He'd gone through on a Fulbright, I think it was. And he kind of connected us both and said, "You're both working in similar fields. You should do something." And obviously, COVID hits and everyone does a podcast suddenly. So we thought we'd do this. But it turns out that we could incorporate a lot of our reporting into it. And there's topics that we've always wanted to sort of dig into. It's a weekly scripted show where we take turns being the main narrator and the guy who's kind of listening to the story. And for about 45 minutes to an hour, we will dig into a topic, be it, Brooklyn wise guys or county lines dealers in London, or it could be the Golden Triangle meth trade or heroin in Marseille in the 1950s. In fact, we did worry that 5 years ago there wouldn't be enough stories to go around, but I've got a list in a spreadsheet somewhere that I think has now got about 380 rows on it. It's almost a never-ending topic.
So when you were drawn to this in the very beginning, when did that start, and why organized crime? Why the underworld?
There is a simple answer and a longer answer. So the simple answer is that I was a freelancer. I had a desk job in a related industry, but I wanted to go back to journalism. And you can't just reach out as a nobody to the president of this or the CEO of that and get comment. You are literally a nobody. But what can you report on? Well, you can report on street crime, the people who do crime. You can, if you've got a bit of smarts, you can get in that way. You can speak to the victims of crime because they tend to be poorer, basically. They don't have PR people around them. And so it is a beat where you can rock up in a place, and if you do your job right, you can speak to the people that matter. Whereas if you're interviewing Donald Trump, you need a pass and you need to get into the press gallery and all of this stuff. So that's the practical way that I got into a lot of this. But then I think that it's a really, really interesting and often undertold story, which is that these are the economies that underpin all of our lives. I mean, from arms trafficking to drugs to corruption to money laundering. I mean, these are illegal gambling, say. These are industries whose profits and turnover would make your eyes water. And they really do drive the interests of all of the governments and companies that we would know off the top of our heads. The drug lords in Mexico or Colombia or wherever they may be, they are just a gloves-off version of the system that we all like to think we live in. And then when you look at certain topics like, say, the Yakuza in Japan, now you're going back to the war in Manchuria, the trade in steel from China, and the birth of the modern meth industry, and Hitler, and the war, and everything that followed. And suddenly you realize that everything is interconnected, and the line between criminal and legitimate is pretty gossamer thin in many cases.
I've always thought that, and yet there are a lot of people who are quite aghast, upset with all of the corruption. We have to get rid of the corruption. I'm thinking corruption is in the eye of the beholder, like beauty. Or is there such a thing as right and wrong in this world? And how do you square yourself with that?
In the American national psyche, especially, the idea of the con man, the flim-flam man, is a kind of romanticized part of the national identity, right? It's the chancer. It's the person who does everything they can to get ahead. And they're criminals. There's nothing, I'm not making a judgment either way about that, but the characters that we love to lionize and become part of the law, I mean, even in Britain, you've got Wat Tyler and Robin Hood and all these people throughout history. These are criminals. These are even people that broke the law for purely egotistical reasons. And so when we're thinking about the people we venerate in our own cultures, they've often stepped over that line. I mean, I think a lot of people really love the strongman leader that is so popular around the world now because he, and it's usually a he, has done crime and been pretty bloody out there about it. It's less a question of right or wrong. I think it's a question of who we allow into the culture. I think in the last sort of 10 to 15 years, the rise of populism all over the world, there's been a shift in the media. I can see it about stories. There's a shift in a tendency not to moralize anymore, which is fine. That's good. A tendency towards viewing moralizing as a kind of weakness or a drawback or just a bit passé. I think that says a lot about where we are right now, but it also says a lot about where we've come from. I think there's been a sort of blurring of the lines of morality generally recently, and I think a lot of that is baked into the economy that we live in. You know, money laundering is just par for the course. Everyone avoids tax. And so it just bleeds in slowly.
Yeah, and when I think about the people that get lifted up in the culture, Hannibal Lecter, people refer to Hannibal Lecter. They refer to Mr. White in Breaking Bad, or Better Call Saul, the lawyer in Breaking Bad, or you can go down the list of all these people. In American culture, people are a bit moralistic in that they feel like they're standing back from it. And they are saying, oh, the corruption is really terrible. And I am a good person. And these people are bad, but I'm still going to cheer them on. And I don't know why people haven't put that connection together between global crime, global industry, and how nobody in those realms of the billionaire class even have a state line or a border to cross. Everything is one country.
I think that in terms of the way that drama and fiction, I'm thinking of screen stuff because that's my background's in writing for screen as well. There was that period in the early 2000s where I think the arc bent towards a more nuanced, truthful view of the anti-hero or the antagonist. You've got your Tony Sopranos and your Detective McNulty's and these kind of characters who are good and bad. They're incredibly dense and tightly woven, and they're well written, and they reflect more the people that you might meet on the street. And now we have this flood of simple mid-90s morality tales again. It's all of these sort of superhero films that I mean, I'm biased, but I can't stand them. I don't think there are any stakes, and I don't think there's any nuance in the stories. And so I wonder what that means as to where we are right now. The issues are really pressing. This is why I'm working on this story in Manila right now, because I think it's a topic that people often shy from because you can't give that optimistic ending. It doesn't have that. The same with a lot of stuff about the environment. I think there was a propensity when we were talking about global warming sort of 10 years ago to be like, oh yeah, and there's this company in China that's just made a thing that can dredge the ocean and save all of our problems. Like, no, not really. And so we shy away from the topics because the solutions have become more and more distant over time. And I think that might be why bread and butter of Hollywood or Chinese cinema or anywhere else at the moment is good versus bad. Here's a baddie, here's a goodie. And actually the populists kind of tag on to this, right? Because in the Philippines case, Duterte called himself Dirty Harry or the Punisher. It's just lifting morality tales straight from Hollywood. I guess what I'm trying to tell with this story is something more nuanced than some of the tectonic plates that are shifting below the simplicity.
What is the spine of your story in the Philippines? Where is it going? If you can maybe give us a sense of that. You don't have to tell the whole story because it'll be written and published. But what are you trying to get across with these three characters, these three women in this neighborhood?
So I guess there's an A narrative and a B narrative, right? So the three women, the three sisters, the three dragon ladies are the A narrative. And really it's about Yolanda's journey as a young activist. In 1986, there was a popular uprising that ousted the dictator Marcos. It's called the People's Power Revolution. Hundreds of thousands of people taken to the streets, and they got rid of him. And it was a really wonderful example of how the people and the church and civil society all came together to kick this guy out. Now, he then got on a plane commissioned by Ronald Reagan and went to Hawaii and lived a very lovely life there. And all the money that he siphoned out has never been found. But the people then took to the streets, including Yolanda, my main character. She was chucking Molotov cocktails at state functions. You know, she was really out there. And it tracks her life and how, like I said, these periodic moments of upheaval, be they fires or floods or deaths in the family, there's a couple of murders, have just squashed, as they would do anyone, squashed her ability to speak out against some of the powers, you know, the many sort of interwoven narratives and antagonists and things that are just pressing down on the poor people in her neighborhood. And she gets to the drug war, and she said something to me last week even, that she said, I reckon if I pulled together 100 people 40 years ago, and told them to rise up against these people, 100 would have done it. Now I'd struggle to find 50, and I reckon I'd probably find 20. And there's a kind of apathy that is soaked into the story that accrues over time as you press people down and you don't give them hope. At the same time, there's a kind of B narrative, which is specifically the drug war and the kind of violence and the horrors that happened 2016 to 2022. And what I did was I focused on two of the women's boys. And so one of them ended up sort of finding a job. The two boys were both addicted to methamphetamine. They're both doing it purely for economic reasons. They wanted to work longer shifts as bus drivers or travel up and down the country doing construction. You know, these are guys working crappy jobs, essentially, for no pay. And so they were taking the drugs to keep themselves awake, to work double shifts. One of the guys got off the drugs and he's now working as a janitor for a local church, and he's got 2 kids and he's really happy. The other guy is still taking the drugs. He broke up with the girlfriend that he had 2 kids with. Strangely, among the very many grandchildren, there are nods to the idea of this new connected economy, like you just mentioned, basically the poor serving the rich as sort of electronic serfs. So there's one of the very young guys, he's 16, right? And he makes his money publishing pornography on social media. So we're into sort of dodgy territory here, which there's a lot of that in the Philippines, this kind of sex industry. There's a girl who's working to become a translator. She wants to move to Seoul. So that's where the money is. She's like, career is going to be where my career goes. And so you get this kind of new digital economy that's coming way after the Three Marias were in the workforce. And so there's this new kind of digital globalized serfdom, which is borderless. It's no less pernicious in many ways. But it's interesting. You know, I don't have to tell the morality of this. The stories kind of tell themselves. I can show and not tell.
I've read some stories of how people get pulled into jobs that are supposed to be jobs. And when they get there, they have their passports taken away. They're put into a room and they have to do social media scams from now on. And so that's very difficult. Coming back to your radicalization around Facebook and social media, do you think the social media arena is what has created the apathy so that you can no longer get 100 people? You can only get 30. People have just given up. They have been so overwhelmed with all this information, their brains won't carry it.
I think there's a basic truth, and I do think it is a truism, that from, say, 15, 20 years ago when social media was seen as democratizing force and was seen to cause, you know, the revolutions across the Middle East. I was living in the Middle East for a while. I covered the Arab Spring and went out to Belarus and saw how social media helped people there. It's just like any new technology. It gets co-opted by the rich over time. And now you see it, whether you're pro or anti-Trump administration, you cannot deny that sphere is dominated by people who are on his side. And that comes with its own dangers, right? Because now it's a kind of zero-sum information libertarianism where you've just handed the biggest mic to the people with the biggest pockets. And so the people with less agency, such as the people in the barangay in Manila, they're getting fed information about the drug war that is completely false and serves the narrative of the former president, because he was savvy enough to build an army of trolls and just put tons of money into flooding the zone with that information. And that's why you get people who, even while seeing their peers shot dead on the streets, they will still tell you this guy is doing a great job. Part of the reason that I'm radicalized against these platforms is that everything has become a very bad faith space. And I think it's vanishing that I see anything approaching the kind of honest argument that you might have in real life.
Well, as we move toward the end of our time together, I would like for you to close reflecting a bit on how creative people that have some need to engage with writing or photography or do what you do or do what I do, how do we keep our center of gravity? How do we keep our sovereignty? What can we do, or what do you do to do that? Because we can get thrown off very easily. I'm thinking Duterte, I was here with Tish. We were in a restaurant with some of her friends, and 3 tables over, she pointed to the table and she said, "Do you see those 2 people over there?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Those are the ones in charge of Duterte's social media." This was 7 or 8 years ago. So he already had a crew of people massaging the situation 7 or 8 years ago. I don't know how they knew who those people were, but they did point to them. And when you said he had that army of trolls, I was thinking about that woman and that man sitting there, beautifully dressed, easy, having a latte or whatever they were having. What do we do, Sean? Any thoughts on that as we say goodbye?
That's a big question.
I know it is, but come on, man.
Yeah, I mean, my personal advice would be just to, if you are going to use social media, just be very aware of how it makes its money. Use it sparingly. Don't take your phone to bed at night. Avoid the glare of the phone in the morning and the evening. As a writer, these things are just distractions, and I've learned to sort of block them out. And it kind of gets to the heart of how I write, which sounds ridiculous, but it's just write and just put pen to paper or, tap it out. Getting rid of those daily distractions and the kind of noise that you might see. I'm a very disorganized person, but I write incredibly organized because I'm terrified of the alternative. I will have a very, very precise funnel for how I get my information and squeeze it out into the sausage at the end. You get your quotes, you transcribe, you select them, you put them in another doc, you get your notes, you do the same, you cut them down, you put them in another doc. This takes months and months and months. I make a timeline on another app on my computer just so I don't have to go back to any notes. It's just there by the time I'm thinking about the nitty gritty of the creative stuff. So yeah, be incredibly organized, and you can't do that if you're looking at 1,000 memes about frogs riding skateboards every day. Finally, walk. I get all my best ideas when I'm walking. Keeps me healthy, and it stops me from going mad. So yeah, walk.
One last thing. Tell us how to connect with your show so people will know where to go to do that.
It's called the Underworld Podcast. The website is underworldpod.com. But if you type in the Underworld Podcast, you'll be able to find us on all of the platforms you get all of your stuff from. So yeah, we're there.
And you have 1 million people a week listening, you said? 600,000 to 1 million?
Yeah, up to that. Well, a month actually. So it's not quite as impressive as that, but we've had up to about 1 million a month. Yeah, it's out there. It's doing all right.
1 million a month's not bad.
It's something. Yeah, it's pretty good.
It's a start. Well, Sean Williams, thank you for connecting with me in Manila. Maybe when I'm here later in the year and you are, we can have some more time together. We'll walk around and look at things. But for now, I appreciate your time.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And there you go, my friends. Thus concludes my conversation with Sean Williams. Just to reinforce what Sean's already told you, if you'd like to follow his work as a journalist and also listen to his podcast he produces each week with his creative collaborator, Danny Gold, once again, his website is underworldpod.com. Underworldpod.com, I like to say that. That's how I connected with Sean. I reached out through the website, got his email, sent him a tip, and he responded back as a proper journalist would. I didn't expect anything less. So it's been a real pleasure to get to know him, and I'm looking forward to more contact with him when I go back to Manila in the fall. As I've said more than once on this show, Manila is an acquired taste. It's not on everybody's bucket list, maybe on a very few bucket lists. Sean did point out it's controlled chaos, and that's what he loves about it. And I've come to appreciate that as well. I know exactly what he's talking about. You never quite know what's going to happen. And of course, that's true with everything in life. Even if you're at home by yourself, you never know what's going to happen because whatever's happening is going to be in the future, of course. Even so, in Manila, things change. Nothing dramatically dangerous necessarily. And yet, as in big cities everywhere, when stuff happens, it can go in either direction. And Manila is just really upfront about all of those directions, seemingly all at once. And I can report all of the experiences I've had in Manila have been positive, except for sometimes the traffic, which can get really heavy. Even that, when you change your perspective from, oh my gosh, I'm stuck in a traffic jam, to this is an intriguing proposition. Sitting here in rush hour, just watching all the action around me. So Manila, in its controlled chaos, requires a constant change of perspective. I have been stressed driving in Manila, so I'm not always sitting there thinking, oh, how interesting. That said, it's important for me to say I've been stressed in the Manila traffic, so I'm not always sitting there thinking, oh, how interesting. Sometimes I'm just frustrated. That's the nature of a place like Manila. That's the organized chaos that Sean was talking about. How do we handle the organized chaos? Or how do we handle the chaos that doesn't seem so organized? And things can change really fast in Manila. For example, Sean mentioned he was doing some work on the former President Duterte. Just in the last couple of days, Duterte was arrested in Manila, was flown to The Hague to face international criminal court charges of crimes against humanity. Mr. Duterte thought he was above the law. Suddenly, he's arrested and in jail. Things turn fast in Manila, that is for sure. And as I finish recording this show for you, I am no longer in Manila. 2 days ago, I returned to the States. I'm in Taos, sitting at my desk, recording the final part of this show. I've unpacked from the trip, and I'm turning around and repacking again, putting everything in a smaller suitcase. Leaving on Sunday, I'm going to France to visit my buddy John in Paris. So I'll be reporting from Paris starting next week. I'll be there for a month and then back to Taos. And just for the record, I travel on the shoestring. So I'm not sitting in first class. Even so, the travel itself, the movement, the organized chaos, that's where the wealth lies. That's where the imaginative stuff lies. That's where the joy and the rhythm and the music exist for all of us. You've probably had similar experiences. One does not have to travel all over the world to have this sense of completeness within the context of the whole world. All you have to do is relax into the rhythms of the day, because no matter where you are in the world, we're not that far away relative to the great cosmos that's out there. We're all fairly close together. We help each other, and we also have to stand alone. Here's a poem I wrote that's in my book, 100 Days Poems After Cancer, and it speaks to the idea of interacting and yet standing alone. The setting is a conversation in New York City between two people, one in an apartment and one fishing in a river in Colorado. Not satisfied with our conversation yesterday about how to release a large trout into a fast-moving stream, my friend Paul Pasquarella phoned again this morning. With my mobile to my ear, I walked down 6 flights of New York stairs, crossed the lobby, and stepped out onto the sidewalk behind a young couple walking west on 29th Street. Paul said, "With wet hands, I took him to the shallows. I held him gently in the easy flow. I moved him back and forth, head to toe, until 3 bubbles of air emerged, and he regained his strength. Until finally, as if he were my own child, I released him." The couple turned south down 3rd Avenue, talking about theater and what they plan to do later. You know, in New York or any big city anywhere in the world, if you're not careful, you can fall out of the sky and splash into the river and nobody will notice. Who wants that? Everybody knows there's juice in giving yourself over to your swagger, your dazzle, your sword-swallowing, fire-breathing days under the big top where trapeze artists soar. Wet your hands. Take yourself to the shallows. Lower yourself gently into the easy flow. Move yourself back and forth, head to toe, until 3 bubbles of air emerge and you regain your strength. Until finally, as if you were your own child, release yourself back into the unreachable depths and velocity of the breaching stream. And there you go, my friends, poem number 84 from my book, 100 Days. When I wrote that poem, I was thinking of the old spiritual song, "I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield, down by the riverside, down by that riverside, down by the riverside. I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield, down by the riverside. Ain't gonna study war no more, ain't gonna study war no more." I think that's a good note to close on. I'm grateful Sean Williams could show up and we could have our conversation in Manila. I'm grateful that you showed up to listen to This show, Twice 5 Miles Radio, fertile ground for conversations worth listening to and remembering. I'm your host, James Nave, always airing first on WPVM LP Asheville, 103.7 and streaming online, WPVMFM.org. The voice of Asheville heard all over the world and on other community radio stations like KCEI, Cultural Energy Radio out of Taos, New Mexico. Thank you, Walter Parks, for our theme song. WalterParks.com for more on Walter's music. Devine Dial, thank you for managing WPVM-FM. Robin Collier, thank you for doing the same in Taos, KCEI, Cultural Energy Radio. You can always reach me, Nave at jamesnave.com. I would love to hear from you. What are you doing in the world? What's going on? What are your opinions about things? Nave at jamesnave.com. I'd like to remind you that we're sponsored by the Imaginative Storm Writing Project. If you would like to improve your writing skills, imaginativestorm.com is a great place to go. We have a free workshop every Saturday and every Thursday on Zoom. You can go to imaginativestorm.com, find the links for those free workshops. It's a community gathering of writers. We'd love to have you. And on that note, once again, thank you for showing up and listening to this show. I really do appreciate it, and I hope you do come back sometime soon. And until then, hey, I'll catch you on that turnaround somewhere down the line.